Employment challenge in the 2020s, the reversal of structural change and realizing the demographic dividend. Today we have Dr. Santosh Mehratra, visiting professor of Development Economics, Center for Development, Bath University, UK. He was professor of Economics, Center for Labour, JNU. He is also professor, senior fellow, Prime Ministerial Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. He completed his MA from New School of Social Research, New York, and a PhD from Cambridge University. He was head of UNICEF's Global Research Program at Innocenti Research Center, Florence, and chief economist, Global Human Development Report, New York, from 1991 to 2006. On returning to India in 2006, he became head, Development Policy Division of India's Planning Commission of India. He was also the Director General of National Institute of Labour Economics Research from 2006 to 2014. In the rank of Secretary to Government of India, he has published 13 books, including 3 with Cambridge University, 4 with Oxford University Press, and others by Sage, Routledge, Z Press, and Penguin. His work has been translated into Hindi, Spanish, French, Russian, German, and Portuguese. On behalf of Sitara, I welcome you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back in this room. I plan to speak for about 40 minutes, 40 to 45, and then I will stop, and I hope we will have plenty of time for discussion. I'm going to pick up on 2 terms here and then ask you a question. The demographic dividend, this is a term that you've come across quite often in normal parlance. Who can define it for me? Or if you try and describe it to me, can you describe it for me? Yes, please.
Dividend is a benefit compared to the other, in our case in other countries. So when we see demographic dividend, for example, India have highest population between, let's say, 18 to 40. That is
18 to 40.
40. So that is, that population is able to create more work, productivity, and GDP for the country compared to other countries. Let's say Japan and other countries where our population is very older. So this kind of demographic dividend. So work hours are human hours that can be converted into monetary gains for the economic gains for the country. That kind of benefit that we have in population growth can be seen as demographic.
Interesting. Let me spell this out a little bit more. It's a phase in the life of a nation. It comes in the life of every nation. And it comes but once in the life of a nation. And almost every nation has been through it. It's that phase in the life of a nation which is the period when the share of the working age population is rising, the share of the working age population is rising, and the share of the dependent population is falling. What is the dependent population? Those who are under 15 and those who are over 60. Not 40, but 60. Because the 15 to 60 year olds, 15 to 60 year olds are contributing to the economy while which the dependents are not. Okay. That's true. That's in some way a crude statement, but take it for granted that that's the way it is by and large. Now, why is it a dividend? It's very important for you to appreciate and understand this, because our dividend began in the early 1980s. We are in 2024. Our dividend is about to end at the end of the next decade. We are going to become an aging society by 2040. Most policymakers, most academics don't even know this, don't understand this, and don't understand what the implications are, because once you become an aging society, you have 2 big problems which you don't have currently. One big problem is that people are living longer, so you have to provide for their health. And as you age, your health problems increase, so your health expenditure as a society is going to increase. And is the system there in place and the health expenditure sufficient, not out-of-pocket expenditure? Very important, this is a subject I'll come back to. That's big problem number one. Big problem number two, if you have an elderly society, an aged society, there's a very large number of elderly people who don't have an income if they don't have a pension. And 91% of our workforce is informal. That means they don't have a pension. So in 15 years' time, when your demographic dividend ends, are we still going to be a country which doesn't provide pensions for the vast majority of our population? 91% of our workforce is informal today. Okay? So we have to build a social security system now, between now and the next 10 to 15 years. If you don't do it, what are we going to have? People working till they fall dead, drop dead on the street. Okay? And we don't have the health system. I think you probably know this, isn't it? I hope you know that we have one of the most privatized health systems in the world. One of the most privatized in one of the poorest countries in the world. What do you think is our rank? I'm going to ask you a question. I hope you have a good answer to this one. What do you think is India's rank in per capita income in the world? In the Comity of Nations? I'm sure everyone knows how big our economy is and how big. We are the 5th largest economy. You're hearing it every day. What's our per capita rank? Can someone tell me? I have a guess here. 150, he says. Anyone else from here? 120. No, I'm not going to ask the professors. 143. Rank in HDI, 131. And we keep patting ourselves on the back. We have become the 5th largest economy. We're about to become the 3rd largest economy. Who cares? Do you care? Does it matter to you? Do you think that it matters to the auto driver, or to the beggar on the street, or to that farmer who's protesting at the Shambhu border in Delhi? I don't think so. So this dividend is a dividend because what happens in the process of structural change in an economy is that early in the stage of development, what you have is a situation where the vast majority are in agriculture. We are still living in a country where 45% of our workforce is in agriculture. In China, it's 30%. This is something I'll come back to in a minute. But a country which is in the process of realizing its demographic dividend, in order to realize its demographic dividend, it must undergo a structural change. What is structural change? It has two dimensions. One, the structure of output changes, and the second is the structure of employment changes. The structure of output changes, meaning the share or the contribution of agriculture to GDP drops, and industry and services rises. And the same thing happens to employment. The structure of employment changes. Why is this called a dividend? It's called a dividend because as people move into industry and services where the productivity per person is higher than in agriculture. So if productivity is higher, incomes are higher. If incomes are higher, people save more. So savings to GDP at the macro level actually increases. As savings to GDP increases, the country's capacity to undertake investment to GDP rises. As investment rises, the growth rate of the economy rises. And the capacity of the country to actually continue and sustain that structural change is enhanced as a result of that. It needs to be a sustained process. That's the dividend. Once this dividend is gone, it never comes back. I've already told you what the consequences of that are. Okay? With that context setting, I'm going to tell you what's been happening to the employment situation and what has happened to the economy. Very quickly, I'm going to move through some numbers to give you a better sense of where we are, what conjuncture we are at in respect of the evolution of our economy. And then I'll talk about what are the components of an industrial strategy or a manufacturing policy for India which will enable us to generate many more jobs, to grow our growth rate much more rapidly, so that we can actually become a developed country. At current rates of development, there's not a hope in hell, regardless of the narrative that is being built. There's not a hope in hell that we are about to become in 2047 a developed country. Okay? I'm going to leave that thought with you for the moment, and we can discuss that if you are interested later. Because as I explained to you earlier, we have to pull workers out of agriculture, into industry, and into services. We've forgotten about industry and manufacturing. We moved on to services. That's not a normal pattern of development. The countries which underwent this structural change underwent the normal structural change, not skipping a stage. If you skip a stage, then you can't absorb the millions of young people who are coming into the labor force. Okay, so what I'm going to argue is that there's already been a reversal of the structural change of output and employment that was happening. And this reversal has happened, unfortunately, within the last 8 to 10 years, 8 or 9 years. A reversal, please try and understand. And then I'll speak about what we need to do to put the economy on a path of structural change and what the components of a manufacturing strategy for India are. I won't say more than that for the moment, because I'm going to come back to that. But first let's look at the current conjuncture in the economic development of our country. Just to give you a very quick snapshot of the last 75 years. We grew at 3.5% per annum, the so-called Hindu rate of growth, between 1950 and 1980. At that time, our population was growing at about 2.25% per annum. And if we were growing at 3.5%, that means our per capita income was growing at 1.25% per annum. Not good enough to actually transform lives. Obviously not good enough to transform lives. If anything, it means that the absolute number of the poor would have increased and increased, as they did. Although the share of the population below the poverty line was falling, that's what the estimates were telling us. Between 1973 and 2004, for a full 30 years of the 60 years that had elapsed since independence, the absolute number of poor in our country had not fallen, while our population had kept growing. Okay? This is a stark fact that you need to keep in mind. Now, so that means even some 20 years after the dividend began in the early 1980s, when our growth rate picked up from 3.5% to 5.5%, our population growth rate began to decline. We were still, per capita income was still growing at something like, 2-3% per annum. Simply not good enough for a transformation. Why is this transformation essential? Because time is running out. Why is the time running out? That's why I began with the BD. We don't have 100 years like the rich countries did. Or maybe 200 years. They have 200 years. We don't have that. Because health systems have changed. It's possible for people to live longer, but it's also possible to bring down fertility rates. We didn't manage to do that. So while we became independent with 330 million people, we are now how many million people? Can someone tell me? 1.4 billion people. We are the most populous country in the world. China was 550 million at the same time they became independent as us. We have exceeded them. Why? Because we didn't invest in the health and education, which enabled China to bring down its population growth rate. So now we are the most populous country in the world, having begun 220 million people less. You understand where we've come from? And we still have the largest number of poor in the world. So it's irrelevant whether you're the fifth largest or the third largest economy of the world. Or is it? It's very relevant, is it? Isn't it irrelevant? It is. Okay. So let's move quickly to the question of economic slowdown. Because we began to grow finally after the 1991 economic reforms at about 6.5% per annum, when our population growth rate had already fallen. So we were getting there after the economic reform. Between 2003, 4 and 15, we were growing for the first time at a historic high of 8% per annum, when our population growth rate had dropped to just over 1% per annum. So, in other words, effectively our per capita income on average was growing at 7% per annum, which is unprecedented in the history of our country. So we had absolutely no choice, we have no choice but to sustain that, because if we don't sustain it, there's not a hope in hell that we will be the Viksit Bharat that we are being told we will suddenly automatically become. Not a hope in hell. So I'm going to move on now as to what happened. That's why I'm bringing the story up to date for you to this conjuncture, where we are over the last 8 to 9 years. There are essentially 4 drivers of growth. First driver of growth is, of course, private consumption. And what we've seen happen to private consumption in the last several years is the following: that private consumption, which rightly accounts for something like 58 to nearly 60% of GDP, that is in the period since 2015, being maintained only by cuts in household savings. Household savings had been systematically rising in the until that period. From about 2003-4 onwards, household savings were rising systematically. Our overall savings rate to GDP had gone from 23% of GDP in 2002-3 to 36% in 2007-8, in a matter of 6 years. It has since come down after that. Investment had gone from 24% of GDP in 2002-3 to 38% of GDP by 2007-8. That's how we managed to sustain GDP growth of about 8% per annum over that 10 or 11 year period from 2003-4 to 14-15. Since then, that growth rate has come down. And what are we seeing here? What I'm saying is that private consumption is now being maintained by cuts in household savings. From their peak of 24% of GDP, they've come down to 17%. How is household savings being maintained? Why? Because inflation is eating away into people's livelihoods. Jobs have fallen, a subject I'll come back to. Jobs have fallen. Wages are stagnant. So people are eating out of their household savings. Okay? People that borrowed, that's the other side of consumption being maintained. So clearly there is a limit to sustained growth on the basis of the middle class and upper middle class incomes, which is class we belong to. That's the class I'm speaking to. So be under no illusion that there is not a very good reason why growth rates have fallen. We were at 8% per annum, we are now at 5.7% per annum. Okay? That's a dramatic drop, because it means a drop in per capita income. And when you combine that with inequality growing, I won't have time to talk about that, we can talk about that in the question, then we've got a real problem. Okay? Gross fixed capital formation, that means investment. I talked about how important investment is. It had gone from 24% of GDP in 20 years ago. Within 7 years, it was already at 38% of GDP, which was nearly getting close to the Chinese levels of investment. Because if you don't invest, you can't continuously grow. You have to grow because we are a very poor country. Per capita income, I'm reminding you of what we began with. Per capita income, 140, 143 rank in the world. We're the only low middle income country among the G20. We keep patting ourselves on the back by telling ourselves, oh, we are the fastest growing large economy in the world in the last 2 years. Aye Baba, we were the second fastest growing large economy in the world for the last 20 years after China. In any case, it's just that China is growing slower. And they deliberately brought their growth rate down. And if we've jumped from 6th place in GDP to 5th place, it's because the UK is collapsing. We just exceeded the UK. No one tells you that. 52% of UK household children miss a meal at night. Is that what we want to compare ourselves to? We clearly are living with that. Our investment to GDP ratio, which I said was 38, it's now currently down to 29. This government inherited 31% of GDP as investment to GDP ratio. It's currently 29%. After rising from a low of 26, why do you think growth rate is down? That's the second driver of growth. The first driver of growth is consumption. Second is investment. The third is exports, net exports. Since our economic reforms began, our exports grew, merchandise exports grew, goods exports grew at 15 to 18% per annum for a 25-year period. Our export to GDP ratio went from 10-11% in 1992 to 25%, which is the Chinese contribution of exports to GDP. And then, since then, it has only come down. Absolute exports, which is the third driver of growth, absolute value of exports in merchandise, $318 billion, 2013-14. For next 5 years, it never reached that level. Policy mistakes I don't have the time to go into. That's why exports fell. That's why jobs are not. Today, India's debt is 172 lakh crores. 172 lakh crores. 55 to 172. As a proportion of GDP, it's gone from 58% of GDP to 81% of GDP. That means you and your children will be repaying the debt that this government has been taking in order to spread the good freebies around in the whole country. While your investment rate has fallen, growth rate has fallen, you're having to feed people, 80 crore people, 800 million people are being fed free grain, and yet your growth rate is down, your revenues are down, your revenue is not growing. Your investment rate is down, your consumption is not increasing, your exports are being held up merely by services exports. So you've got a structural crisis, is what I'm trying to tell you. There's no question about it. Moving on, very quickly. But what's the narrative? You live in this city, which is the financial capital of this country. All the big banks have their chief economists here, right? The fast-growing part of the new India, we are being told every other day in the press, is this 15% which is central to growth. The HSBC chief economist will tell you that. Morgan Stanley in report after report every 6 months will tell you that. Standard & Poor's is telling you that. I won't include Raghuram Rajan in this, but we can talk about Raghu if you're interested. More important, they talk about just two subtypes of things. This New India narrative comprises two high-tech goods and services sectors. One set of sectors consists of mobile handsets, pharma, auto and IT services. And then India is gaining a global market share since 2017. Very good. No complaints. Absolutely right. And within IT services, that's one of the things that the high-tech goods and services New India economy. India is no longer a giant call center as it was in the 1990s, nor is it a software services provider as it was in the 2000s. It sells now accounting, legal, R&D services, and India has become the hub of global capability centers. In other words, it services, provides, gives services for multinationals, and these will continue to grow. That's what you're being told. The second high-tech sector is, of course, grown on account of the digital public infrastructure, which is called India Stack. I'm sure you've heard this term, which tech startups have plugged into, spreading across fintech, e-commerce, edtech, logistics, and foreign capital has been attracted to promote startups here. There's a lot of narrative about how many unicorns this country has. Unicorns are firms which have very rapidly become $1 billion companies, and most of those are startups. Absolutely fantastic news, but of course you must have heard the most recent news that in the last 3 years, what we've seen is a dramatic fall in close down of startups, and hundreds of workers, thousands of workers being laid off into startups. Nevertheless, that's 15% of the economy. Now, the narrative that we're being given is that if these sectors grow, the GDP has been expanding at 6.5% and can expand at the same rate for the next decade. But the economy is expanding, as I told you earlier, at 8%. And we were then generating 7.5 million new non-farm jobs each year. 75 lakh new non-farm jobs were being generated, so that there was an extremely low unemployment rate, which is a subject I will come back to in a second. But we are now patting ourselves on the back about the 6.5% growth, higher than the 6% pre-COVID. And that will double GDP, we are being told, in 11 years, so we will go from 3.75 trillion now to 7.5 trillion. That will make us the third largest. That's the narrative. Right or wrong? Am I right or am I right? Okay. But the same people will also recognize, and notice the next bullet, it's in quotes, but it's not enough to create the 70 million jobs needed over the next decade, unquote. This is a quote from the chief economist of HSBC. 70 million jobs in the next decade? We need 10 to 12 million jobs, as I will demonstrate to you very shortly, per annum, because we are adding 5 to 6 million young people entering the labor force each year. And we are not even thinking about the millions we have to pull out of agriculture, nor are we thinking about all the girls who've gotten educated and who are entering the labor force, and nor are we thinking about the stock of unemployed that we managed to create, because in 2017 we had the highest rate of unemployment in the 45-year history of this country. 17-18. Why? Because of twin shocks this economy was inflicted with. Which twin shocks? Tell me what twin shocks we were inflicted with in late 2016 and in... Thank you. Louder. It sent shockwaves through the economy, particularly in the unorganized sector, and it's the unorganized sector and the MSMEs which create most of the jobs in the economy. The corporates that you keep reading about in the press, in the pink press in particular, they hardly create any jobs, because most of them are highly capital intensive and highly capital intensive and import intensive. I won't have the time to go into this, But they themselves are saying not enough to create the 70 million. It's not 70 million. You have to create 120 million in the next 10 years. Because you haven't a clue about the demographic trends in this country. Right? And so they are saying, oh, it would generate only 1/3 of the jobs needed. Well, if it generates only 1/3 of the jobs needed, what about the 85% of the economy, which is old economy? We'll come back to that in a minute. So the hope is, that's the narrative. So the hope is that new India economy would energize old India. How? Why? Well, digital infrastructure can help clusters of small manufacturing firms enjoy advantages of large manufacturers through cheaper credit, large end markets, new credit platforms, tech solutions for agriculture. That's the hope. Now look at this. This tells you what the old economy looks like. And this is only the non-farm economy, I'm not even talking about agriculture. Because 45% of our workforce, what is 45% of our workforce? 260 million. Believe it or not, and I'm just going to make a passing remark here. In the year 2018-19, not so far away, not so long ago, agriculture was not 260 million, it was 200 million. 60 million people have been added to agriculture thanks to the twin shocks and the shock of the 4-hour notice lockdown. The strictest lockdown in the world. The Blavatsky School of Governance in Oxford has done a metric of countries which had lockdowns and how strict they were, how stringent they were. They said, we were top of the league for an extended period in the strictest lockdown at 4 hours notice. Don't have the time to go into this, but I want you to understand what the scale of enterprise informality in our economy is. I'm going to ask you to sort of, because it's a busy slide, bear with me and look carefully at where I'm pointing the cursor. Unorganized, can you, oh sorry. Unorganized, organized. This is all non-farm, okay? Now go to the last column. 15, 16, that's the latest data. This government, of course, doesn't like revealing data. For the last 4 years, it's been doing unorganized sector enterprises survey. I was a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics for the government for 3 years. They kept telling us about what was happening with the data collection. They still didn't reveal it. They didn't release it. They're still waiting. Why do you think they didn't release it? Because they don't want the whole world to know what a massive shock the demonetization and the GST and the lockdown delivered. Because if you release them, you instantaneously know how they were knocked sideways. Now listen to this. Unorganized sector share of all enterprises. This is, I'm talking about not workers but enterprises. Note what I'm saying. 30% are unorganized, which is, in other words, employ less than 10 workers. Okay? Now, within the unorganized, some 67, 68% are not registered. 30% are registered. Where are they registered? In some act or the other, in different states, under different acts and authorities. Is there one database? We call ourselves India Stack, this great country with this digital infrastructure. Have we brought it together? No. So the government actually, I have a paper which just came out in the Indian Journal of Labour Economics. It's called Enterprise Informality in India, the Blind Spots of Policy. It uses, to start with this data, to tell you that when the shocks came to the, on account of these triple shocks that I've just been describing, the government didn't even know how many units there are. If you don't even know, how are you going to provide any help? Not that you are interested in providing help, because actually you are interested only in the national champions. You know who the national champions are, I assume. If you don't, I'll tell you later. 100%, that's 630 plus sort of, in the construction sector that's about 2%, see that's 100. But first go down all the way here. Total organized, total unorganized. So the unorganized total is 97%, 96.7. And total organized is 3.34. That's what the pink press is about. That's what you read about every day. Headlines, the entire pink press is just full of this. And every engineer who's coming out of here, who will go, of course, to the IIMs, will join this 3.34%. Be under no illusion. There are some maverick people sitting here in this part of the room who wouldn't do that, but I'm just telling you what happens to the reality. That's the reality. Because these people, taxpayer money, my taxpayer money is here subsidizing the education of people who will all join this 3% and service them or join ABN AMRO, Deutsche Bank and Goldman Sachs. And it's my taxpayer money which is subsidizing this. Why? Each of these guys should be paying through their nose. Not the poor, but we'll move on. More important is the entire non-farm sector. 97% units are unorganized, 3.34 are organized. That's your old economy. I'm talking about the entire non-farm sector of the country. So be under no illusion, because we have 66 million enterprises in the whole country, non-farm. 66 million, of which, of course, a very significant share is on account worker. The mochi, the nai, all these people sitting outside the gates of IIT, they're all units. They're not just workers, they're also units, on account workers. You take out the on account worker, you still have a massive, the dukandar, the this, that and the other. You understand? The wife sitting there, the child is sitting there. That's your economy. That's the real economy. That's the old economy. Self-employment has shot up in the last 5 years alone from 53% of total employment to 58% of total employment. Okay, so that's your old economy. 15% is supposed to pull 85% forward. I don't have to say more. I'm going to move on very quickly in the interest of time. So what are the 3 groups that need jobs? I mentioned them briefly, but I need you to recognize this. Each of these groups is a looming jobs crisis. What do I mean by that? Farm, landless, marginal farmers, small and marginal farmers, the plot sizes have shrunk because populations have been growing at a phenomenal rate, so they have fallen extremely small and they're just not productive, and therefore incomes are not growing, therefore there's rural distress. That's why people want to leave agriculture. They need to leave agriculture. That's what development is about. I talked about that earlier, right? But is that happening? It had begun to happen on a massive scale. I'll come back to that in a second. But what we've seen is reverse migration. I'm going to move on. The second group. So the first group is a stock which has to be provided jobs. The second group is a flow. Youth turning 15 or more or after finishing education, entering the labor force. All getting better and better educated, quote unquote, educated. Certified, yes, but if you follow the annual survey of education report, I'm sure you know ASA report, right? You know learning levels of these children who are supposed to be all certified. Because we've achieved 97% primary enrollment, we've achieved 85% secondary, we've gone from 11% in higher education to 26% in the matter of 10 years between 2011 and 2016, but they are now entering the labor force. They are all looking for work. So I'll show you in a second what has happened to open unemployment rates. And remember that they are not going to work in agriculture. That's not what they got educated for. Their parents didn't get much education, so they work in agriculture out of sheer necessity. These youngsters don't want to be in agriculture. Why should they? Subset of this, girls. Did you know the labor force participation rates of women in our country are among the lowest in the world? They're about as bad as they are in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. I'm falling at that. I'm falling. Okay? Now, but a very important Nandi Foundation survey done in the year 2018 of 13 to 19-year-olds, teenage girls in this country, 70,000 across 20 states of India, found the following in the answer to the question, what age do you want to get married? The answer was 25% don't want to marry until 18 to 20, which is the legal marriage age, and 51% said they didn't want to marry between 21 and 25. Legal marriage age is 18. So in other words, they all want to work. They don't want to get married. But if they don't find work, what are they going to do? They are going to get married. And why is that important? Because if you marry early, you'll have children early. Your TFR is not going to drop at the rate at which we need to do. Total fertility rate. We need to bring our total fertility. Why do you think we've become the most populous country in the world? I began by telling you 330 million people is what we were. China was 550. We've exceeded them and topped them. How did they manage to bring it down? Their population growth rates? And do not tell me one-child policy. One-child policy came in 1983. They had already brought it down before 1983. Why? Because they invested in health, in education. If you read my work, you'll find that countries which managed to do that early in their development process, Kerala did, Sri Lanka did in our part of the world, brought it down, Tamil Nadu has done, and now most of the South is done. Which is why the South is up in arms against the North. I won't go there, but I want to, because you're all young people, you need to begin to understand why the South is so riled up. They have very good reason to be riled up. Because the only two states of the country which still have a TFR over 2 large states are, tell me which, you tell me, which have a total fertility rate defined as the number of children an average woman has between the reproductive years of 15 and 49. The country's fertility rate is 2. In the National Family Health Survey, we've already been told we are below replacement rate of 2.1. Which are the 2 states of the country? And there are 3 northeastern states, I'm not thinking about them, they are so tiny they are irrelevant. Tell me the 2 major states of India. Thank you, UP and Bihar. Come on, I thought this was obvious. 3 is the TFR of Bihar, 2.5 is the TFR of UP, the only 2 states. And if you read the newspapers, front page headlines, every day, about the great progress that's being done in UP. Okay? Is anyone telling you how, if the TFR, what's being done to improve the TFR? Why do you think UP's per capita income is one half of the national average? Because they have the highest population among the highest population growth rates. Why do you think Bihar's per capita income is 1/3 of the national average? It has been so for 20 years, by the way, ever since Sushasana Babu has been in power. For 20 years, it's been 1/3 of the national average. It used to be 70% of national average in 1960. I've just done 175-page study with my PhD students on the Bihar economy and Bihar's employment prospects. And I was myself stunned. कि एक ज़माना था वो 70% थे. They now, since about 20 years, when they came down to 33, they're still at 33. No improvement. So you imagine, if you don't invest in health and education, where are you going to get to? I'm going to move on very, very quickly because I'm already spoken for too long. And finally, you have the stock of unemployed. You had 10 million, only 10 million unemployed in 2012. I'm saying openly unemployed. In a developing country, the open unemployment is extremely low. Why? Because people are too poor not to work. Because there's no social security. That's what I began by talking about. They're too poor not to work. कुछ भी मिल जाए, कितना भी मिल रहा हो, काम करना है. Therefore, the open unemployment rate was 2% in 2012, and therefore 10 million unemployed. In 2017, our unemployment rate had shot up to 3 times as much, about 6.1%, and it had gone to 2019 to 30 million. 3 times. And of course the numbers have grown since then, although the government contests that. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there because I could do that. As part of this process, I want to remind you of something which I was saying at the beginning. That structural change is a dimension of the demographic dividend. What is structural change? That the structure in manufacturing rises and that of services rises. The same thing happens for employment. First we are looking at the share of manufacturing in GDP, that's the blue bar, and then the share of manufacturing in employment, 3 points of time. Immediately after the economic reforms began, 1993, next is 2012, and then is 2018. And notice that the share of manufacturing in output was about 17%, it remained 17% 20 years later. Absolute, of course, in this period, absolute employment in manufacturing was growing. Share wasn't increasing because manufacturing was not growing faster than the economy. That's why the share remained stable. But notice what happens to employment. It's rising from 93 to 2012, it then drops. And 2018, the contribution to manufacturing also drops. So what I'm saying, this is the reversal of structural change. What you want is structural change with development. Not only has the growth rate come down, but there's been a reversal of structural change. Now, I'm not spending very much more time than this because I want to move on. I don't want you to go away thinking Professor Mehrotra had a very long sob story to tell. I'm now going to tell you what we can do about it, because we have hope. We can do it. We've done it before. In the period between 2000 and 2012, we were generating 7.5 million new non-farm jobs every year. We now have to generate, because of the three groups who have to be provided the stock and the flow, we have to provide 10 to 12 million new jobs. Certainly in the next 10 years. That number might drop after that until the dividend ends, but until then we have to really up our game. No question about it. You don't, we will age and we will still remain relatively poor. Not become Viksita Bharata. Because no one is telling you how we are going to get from A to B. We are already told we will become Viksita Bharat. Is there a roadmap? Have you seen a blueprint? Is there a document that you've seen that tells you, I'm going to go from here to there and this is how we're going to do it? We used to have a planning commission, we used to do this. I used to work there. I used to write the 11th and the 12th five-year plan. So we know what we were doing. I'm not going to talk about that, but we don't have a single document. You name me one single document. Not one single document you can name me. I'm going to move on very quickly. I've already told you that thanks to the twin shocks of 16, 17, and then the shock of the lockdown, we added 60 million to agriculture. Okay, 60 million. For the first time from independence to 2004, after 2004 we began to reduce the absolute number of workers in agriculture because we were generating very rapidly non-farm jobs at the rate of 7.5 million per annum. However, because we were growing at 8% per annum. However, and that process went on from 2004. For the first time, the absolute number of workers fell. Absolute number of workers fell. Okay? However, from 19, for 15 years, the absolute number of workers fell. From 19 to now, we added 60 million workers to agriculture, and the share of agriculture has gone up. So we've seen a reversal of structural change. So we've now worsened that problem that I was telling you about, that we've got to pull workers out of agriculture. We not only have to pull these 60 million out, we have to pull many more million out who are already there. China, share of manufacturing to GDP, 30%. No, 25%. Share of manufacturing and employment, 30%. Where are we? 17 and 11.5. Bangladesh, share of manufacturing and employment, 16%. Where are we? After a rise, we are down to 11.5. I have 5 more minutes. I'm going to sort of run through my components of a manufacturing strategy in the next few minutes. I'm not going to dwell on this because I've already told you, but this you must look at, because this affects you. You are the demographic dividend. This dividend will be gone in 15 years' time. Look what has happened to the open unemployment rates between 2012, the blue line, this is by level of education. Okay? My analysis of government data. The blue line is 2012, and look what happens if you are graduated when open unemployment rate went from 20% to 34% between 12 and 1920, and it's only slightly come down. If you were an MA or an MSc, an MTech, it went from 18% to 37%. If you were a tech graduate, not from IIT. If you were a tech education graduate and above, it went from 20% to 38%. Because, why did I make this aside about not from IIT? Because we are a Brahmanical education system. We are a Brahmanical society, and we have a Brahmanical education system. That's what you are part of. You are the Brahmins of the education system. So you will not experience 38%. But the absolute number of, I want to give you a highlight. Forgive me, some interesting numbers keep coming up in my head which sort of would interest them, therefore I keep giving it. 20 years ago, there were only 10,000 affiliated colleges affiliated to universities. Today there are 42,000. Most of them are private. Set up by who? Politicians, developers who want to turn their black money into white. They can't find the teachers, they can find the students, because enrollment rates have risen. So demand for education is very high. So people keep coming out of these colleges and so-called universities and engineering colleges and management schools, and you get the unemployment rate that you're looking at. Because they are unemployable. Okay, moving on very rapidly. What's the way out? There is a way out. Make in India? I won't go there. We don't have the time to go into that. Because if Make in India was doing it, you wouldn't see the reversal of structural change. I've already proven to you that Make in India was literally that, a JUMLA. Because manufacturing employment actually fell in absolute terms in the first 5 years after the government came in power. Absolute terms means that had never happened since economic reforms began. Never in our history had it happened. Because the most labor intensive, we are a labor surplus country. The most labor intensive sectors are 5 in manufacturing. Leather footwear, garments, textiles, food processing and furniture. Account for 50% of total manufacturing employment. They saw an absolute decline in employment. That's Make in India. I won't say more. As a result of jobs not growing, you had, at least when jobs were growing between 4, 5, and 11, 12, real wages were increasing, regular salaries were increasing, casual wages were increasing, but between 11, 12 and 17, 18 is the highest unemployment rate, your wages became flat or they began to fall. And the same thing has happened since then. This is what happened between 17, 18 and 22. This is flat again. Manufacturing, this is not, construction, flat again. Services, flat again. So you've got a high rate of inflation and jobs are not growing and too many people looking for work and not finding it. So why would wages grow? I'm not talking about Deutsche Bank, which is where B.Tech walas and M.Tech walas from here will go. We are under no illusion because here you will only hear, oh, I got a package for 20 lakhs, oh sorry, 40 lakhs. And the next person will say, I got one for 50. That's not what I'm talking about, right? That's the Brahmanical education system versus the rest. Because there is, in the education system, an OBC, an extremely backward, an SC, as well as an ST. Okay? Moving on. So how do we go? Where do we go?
2 minutes.
Yep. 7 points in 2 minutes.
Okay, 3 minutes.
No, I don't need more than that. I assure you I don't. That's why I'm going through. We need an industrial policy. For 30 years we haven't had an industrial policy. We still don't have one. Make in India is not. PLI is not. Performance linked incentive scheme is not. I won't go into why not. If you're interested, I'll tell you. If we have an industrial policy, we can make the natural transition, bring workers out. Because there is no country in the world, not one, which has managed to reduce poverty, which hasn't developed its manufacturing. You cannot reduce poverty on the strength of services alone. Because services, there's a limit to how much services can grow. Because what is a service? You service production. You service agricultural output. You service industrial output or construction. Real things. And what are services? The distribution, the transport, the banking, the insurance, etc. associated with the production. You understand? But what do our B.Tech and M.Tech walas do? From here they go straight to IIM and then to ABN AMRO or Deutsche Bank or Morgan Stanley. Services. Because that's where the money is. With your parents' taxpayer money and their taxpayer money and my taxpayer money. Don't forget that. We need an industrial policy. What else do we need? We need a coherent manufacturing strategy aligned to our export and import policy. I can't explain this to you. My suspicion is that many of you are not economists, even if you are. Pankaj says I don't have the time, so I won't tell you. But read my paper. Read my work. Very simple. This is an invitation to follow me on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, and you will get access to all my stuff. You need a manufacturing strategy, an explicit industrial strategy, not a PLI. Next, you need special packages for 5 labor-intensive sectors. Third, you need cluster development to support micro, small and medium enterprises because they are the ones who generate the jobs. The large firms do not. I told you that in the beginning, the old economy, 3% don't generate the jobs because they're very capital intensive and they're very import intensive. One story, forgive me Pankaj, I have to tell you this. My fridge broke down. The mechanic said, compressor काम नहीं कर रहा सर. मतलब कौन सा लगाएं सर? I have a Samsung fridge. कौन सा लगाएं सर? He reeled off names. मैंने कहा हिंदुस्तानी कोई गॉडरेज लगाओ ना. गॉडरेज लगाया. मैंने पूछा ये गॉडरेज तो है मगर बना कहाँ? बोला सर ऐसे सोचा हिंदुस्तान में बना. बोला चाइना में बना. मैंने कहा गॉडरेज चाइना में बनाता है और हमको इंपोर्ट करके यहाँ लगा जाता है. That's your corporate, Indian manufacturing corporate, okay? They're not manufacturers, they're traders. Okay? That's why manufacturing jobs don't grow. That's why our IITs don't supply engineers to manufacturing. That's why engineering, you have to have the human resources to man the industries. What we can provide is software services and consulting services, and that's why all the best jobs are in Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and KPMG. Cluster development is the strategy of the late industrializer. China did it. You know how many clusters there are producing socks in China? 100. 100 clusters, geographic clusters just producing socks. Can you imagine how efficient their production must be? So you pull up your trousers, all the boys, and see if you're not wearing Chinese socks. Fourth, manufacturing policy. We need to focus on our mid-sized towns, which have very poor infrastructure, but we need to align our urban infrastructure development with the clusters. There are 6,000 clusters of geographic clusters of industry in our country. 6,000 of them. I don't have the time to name even one or two of them, otherwise Pankaj is going to drive me out.
All be driven out.
I know. I'm joking. So you understand, it's just not just the East Asian, all the East Asian countries had an industrial policy. We still don't have one for 30 years. But it's not just that we don't have an industrial policy. We now don't have an education or a TVET policy which underpins the industrial policy. Read a paper of mine in Economic and Political Weekly which looks at China's skill development policy. I was sent 10 years ago when I was in the time profession to China to examine their skill development ecosystem. I came back completely, my mind boggled with the success story that was. Unbelievable. We still have under 4% of our workforce, 4% of our workforce which has formally acquired vocational education or training, 7% of our workforce in manufacturing has got technical training, the BTech level, 7%. Moving on, we have to have a TVET system, technical vocational education training system to underpin an industrial policy. Moving on very rapidly, that's 5 already. 6 and 7, 2 more components of India's manufacturing strategy. We've got industrial corridors which are coming up. One is called the DMIC, the Delhi-Mumbai. Then there is the Amritsar Kolkata. But there are 3 others which are planned, of which the most most advanced are Chennai-Bangalore. But there are, the most advanced stage are the Vizag-Chennai one. And then of course you have the Chennai-Bangalore and Bengaluru-Mumbai. So following the golden quadrilateral, okay, across the country. Very good thing if we manage to develop industrial corridors along that, because then we'd also manage to attract more industry there and therefore more jobs there. And finally, and that should interest people in this institution, creating a design and innovation system, because these institutions, when they were created, the IITs, they were ones who were training people to actually design products and processes. And designing and having the capacity, indigenous capacity, to design products and processes is central to our industrial policy and having a manufacturing ecosystem which grows and then generates jobs and therefore takes the country forward and enables you to realize your demographic dividend. Thank you very much for your attention. I really apologize, I've gone on longer than I intended. I've compressed into 1 hour what I would take a semester to teach.
No, actually, the energy that he brings to, and I was just wanting to take some credit. I think there was something in the audience that was also giving the energy. I just thought, but the only thing that comes to mind is at least the first part was an absolutely clear X-ray of what is happening. That's the sense I got of such a deep, such a sharp understanding and an exposition of what's there in this country and the economy. So thank you so much, Santosh. We would have loved to kind of hear more, but there is the pabandi of time. And let's open this up. Any questions? We might have time for only 3 questions because there's a class probably that will come in, but if they don't, then we can carry on. So go that side first. Please do introduce yourself and your questions.
Good evening, sir, and thank you so much for this extremely informative session. I have one question regarding the extent of pseudo unemployment in our country. Do you have any mechanism to address the pseudo unemployment for everyone? Pseudo unemployment.
Are you talking about underemployment?
No, it's, I mean.
What do you mean by pseudo? Because that's a term, that's a new term for me.
Yeah, so pseudo unemployment is a thing as far as I know. In agriculture we say that the 45% of our total workforce is working in agriculture, but that doesn't mean that that is the actual requirement of the agricultural sector.
So you are saying underemployment. You are saying underemployment.
Okay.
So they 45% produces 15% of the GDP.
Right.
So that's very low productivity agriculture. Too many people, but yes, of course. Please carry on. Sorry.
So yeah, I'm just asking. You have shown the youth open unemployment in one of your slides. So do we have any mechanism to measure the actual requirement in agricultural sector and whether we are covering the whole workforce in that sector? I mean, I just want to know whether we can measure
the requirement in agriculture, that's a tough one. But really, I'll give you a counterfactual and then you make your own judgment from that. Given that we are the most populous country in the world, we can't go to a point where agriculture is contributing, let us say, as in the United States, perhaps 10 or 15% of GDP, but employs only 2% of the workers, because that is simply not humanly possible, because they have 1/5 of our country's population. So that's why I think I indicated, it was an indicative number, when I said we need to move towards 30% of our total employment being in agriculture, because they will continue to employ 15% of our, and you know, if productivity in industry and in services increases, as it is likely to, then, you know, the share of agriculture is going to shrink in any case. So under no circumstances. And we've got to change the pattern of agriculture also, and I'm not going to go to MSP and so on. I could, but I won't. And I can tell you in one sentence that MSP is extremely important. If we don't have it, in fact, we will continue to suffer as severely in agriculture as we are currently doing, and incomes are not going to grow. Okay. I'm being very telegraphic in my answers, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, because it is IRD in there. IRD, go ahead. Be a little longer. Till the mic comes on.
So 1.5 questions.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I am Ayadi, first year master student from Satara. My first question was in the context of what you started describing as things we could do to counter this and the comparison with China that you drew. We studied in our last class that out of the 25 digital public infrastructure companies in spaces, out of the 25, 11 are China, which is again highest of any other country, even the US. India had 2. One of them was Flipkart, and then it fizzled out. I mean, it's not Indian anymore.
Bought, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted you to describe how these policies of China especially contributed to something like this, and that adds on to the second part of the question in the context of climate that developing countries like us have to face.
That, but most of the time they're not. They didn't. So finally the money came in. The second, I think, fortuitous development was COVID. COVID meant that there was an opportunity for edtech, fintech, food tech, health tech to grow. That growth has sort of petered out now. It's pretty big. I'm not saying e-commerce is not growing. Of course it's growing. It's penetrating all the way to tier 3, 4 towns. No question. There are plenty of competitors to Flipkart and to Amazon. But there are downsides to edtech and there are limits to health tech. Fintech, again there are limits because the real financial system is already waking up to the risks in it. Let me explain. We've already had 2 crises associated with NBFCs. The first crisis came about 5-6 years ago, and the non-banking financial companies, they were being given loans by the public sector banks and the private sector banks after their NPAs had risen, so they couldn't lend anymore to the big loans to corporates. They couldn't give any longer. Okay, so they decided, अच्छा ऐसा करते हैं, NBFCs को दे देते हैं. Let them manage our sort of portfolio. So what did the NBFCs do? They borrowed short and they lent long to construction companies and to developers. But then, as I explained to you, among the first drivers of growth, I think that consumption was not rising because jobs are not growing, therefore demand for housing was not growing, so that what happened with the NBFCs, they collapsed. The construction companies collapsed, so the NBFCs began to collapse. And what is this? What is the government doing now? चलो मुद्रा कर देते हैं, मुद्रा बांटो, जैसे खराब बांट रही है, क्योंकि जेब से तो जा नहीं रहा, वो जा रहा है बैंकों से, अब उनका एनपीए बढ़ जाएगा तो कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता, क्या फर्क पड़ता है, और तो चलो फिर से एनबीएफसी के द्वारा दे पैसा. अरे जो, in other words, creating the potential for another crisis down the road. So, you know, let's look at the fundamentals in the economy and how much potential there is for these types of activities to grow. I don't have to tell you that startups have been shrinking, shedding workers on a massive scale. So let's get real is what I would say. Yeah.
Okay. We have one last question, and if there's no class, then we can continue. So please go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Professor. I'm Kiran Yogi.
Yeah, loud and clear.
But just.
हाँ वो बात नहीं रहा बेटा, तुम बोलो.
I'm Alisha from Center for Policy Studies. And Professor, actually, since you also mentioned about Professor Raghuram Rajal, and so he's also in this recent book very interestingly arguing that India should now focus on services. But one argument that he does pose, which also makes sense, that manufacturing itself has limits, as services has limits. So the argument that he makes is of this, that how...
I know the argument.
Yeah, Professor. So I think it will be really great if you could respond.
I'll deal with that. I intended to, so I'm glad that you're asking the question. Because he's been the talk of the town, and I have great respect for Raghu, and Raghu is very serious, there's no question about it. And actually his argument is correct, but in a limited way. Let me explain. I think I hinted at that he's on the right track. We do need to piggyback on our potential for enhancing our services export. It's a way of sustaining our services export growth and therefore buttressing our foreign exchange earnings. Because let's remember that our services exports have actually managed to hold up our current account deficit, because our merchandise exports are not growing anywhere close to the rate that we were going earlier. So yes, he's got a good strategy and I would back him. Point one. Point two. Is it a strategy for creating jobs? No, it is not. It's a creation strategy for 10-12% of the population who've got an excellent education. Not everyone gets into NIT or IIT. करोगे तो क्या करोगे? So उन्हीं को मिलना है. तो क्या? Who is much smarter than one would be? It's a very silly argument he's making. It's not going to generate the jobs. And he's completely off the mark when he says, oh, so what? Manufacturing can't be a way forward because there's deglobalization taking place, share of world trade in GDP is dropping, so India can't follow the Chinese path and the East Asian. Who's saying we should do that? Of course not. That's not the idea. The idea is that you have a vast population in this country which is still consuming, still spending a very significant share of its income on essential commodities. They might have diversified their food consumption pattern, but they're not consuming, manufacturers. And the reason why we were growing at 8% per annum, as I demonstrated in the new book I'm finishing on the economy and jobs, is precisely this, that pattern growth was an inclusive pattern. That's why jobs were growing, wages were growing, consumption was growing, therefore poverty is falling, and these were the same people who were getting jobs in the unorganized sector, and that was happening because domestic demand was growing. And what was the logic of the domestic demand? Please try and appreciate and understand the logic there. I've just tried to explain to you. If you have a growth pattern that generates jobs in the non-farm sector, then your incomes are higher, then so that, what is the fastest growing manufactured in that period? Labor intensive one. वो जो अभी तक करीब था, जब उसकी इनकम बढ़ती है, तो अभी तक बच्चे स्कूल चप्पल पहन के चले जाते थे, that would have been big deal. अब वो जब बच्चे जूता पहन के जा रहे हैं, पहली चीज. दूसरा, उनके पास एक जोड़ी कपड़ा था, अब उनके पास 3 जोड़ी कपड़े हैं. कहाँ बन रहे हैं वो? वहीं गांव के आसपास से बन रहे हैं. तीसरी चीज, when the family goes out, and they have the money now to go out because they come out of poverty, wages are rising, they have non-farm jobs. Family bachas want to drink Coca-Cola and Thumbs Up. You understand? They want to have a biscuit, which they didn't have access to then. They now get milk, which they have to buy because their plot size is too small for them to have a cow. These are processed foods. They had a cart at home, they now have a charpai and they have some plastic or wooden furniture. Some. These are the sectors that are growing. The woman who earlier had 1 sari and 1 blouse or 2 at best, she now has 3 or 4. You understand what I'm saying? That's an inclusive growth process. You have so much unspent domestic demand.
I'm sorry because the class is
waiting. Unspent domestic.
We can continue outside.
Yeah.
And I'm really sorry to interrupt this, but
No.
So a big round of applause. We are so thankful to you, and it's been absolutely fascinating and fantastic. I'm going to request a little token of our appreciation. This is a Khadi staff from Mother Sangrahalaya, Sevagram. So, please.